do certain things, from acquisition, generation, up to contract closeouts. Just a question of processes, right? So it's free game, and it allows them to. It allows us to build trust with them to ensure that there is a fair treatment of their offer whenever they provide one. So that's the transparency part of it. RFIs are good, but sometimes we may use it not essentially to address these specific requirements, but to do a checkbox. It's a requirement to make sure that we recognize the small business set-aside contribution. It is very, very important for small business set-aside. So when we release RFIs out there, we want to make sure that the small business has a chance to look at the requirements. The question is it essential to send out an RFI to large businesses as well? So here's where the balance is on how you do how do you look at your schedule and controlling the resources that you extend to send out an RFI out there, and then have time for them to look at the RFI, generate and spend money to respond to those RFIs. And then for you to evaluate those RFIs out there. So another aspect of engagement is once you send out the solicitation, the final solicitation, remember we do due diligence, we send them a copy of our draft solicitation, whether it's robust enough or not. It gives the contractors a chance to criticize or ask more questions about our specific requirement. But once the solicitation is out, the only remaining way for them to ask questions about the specific requirement is the Q&A. Right? They send their inputs to you, and the government gets to evaluate it and answer in a formal way. Is there a way to do that interactively? Is there a way to do that without the penalty that you're going to get protested if you provide more information than you're supposed to? Another engagement that we do is FedSim has an industry advisory council. It is a council where we invite the industry to basically critique our processes, the way we conduct our businesses, the way we do our requisition, our solicitation, ask us how to do the basic steps, the general steps of the evaluation, not specific to the requirement. So that allows the industry to basically run a list of all suggestions, best ways, best values, or best ways of doing things, and for us to evaluate whether we can incorporate that into our solicitation, into our processes. So we have a lot of inputs from industry to allow us to better ourselves. Should we have that in our agencies? An industry advisory council to allow the industry to provide that feedback, immediate feedback to the agency.
I think that industry advisory council is a great idea. I think it works in GSA. You talked about interaction. GSA also uses interact, which allows for don't say questions are due on this date and that's it, it's cut off. It allows for constant back and forth dialogue, and I think that's good. I think these things do get to what Ken said. It becomes a workload and a people and a resource issue to do all this. In terms, I'd like to ask the audience a question, the industry members. Do you feel like the processes that you see from your side work well today? Are you appropriately engaged in the requirements development process? So if you agree that you are appropriately engaged and works well, please raise your hand. I'd like to see one hand. So for the people who are here in government, there's nobody in industry who thinks it works well, if they're all being honest. For the people in government, do you think the process of requirements development and developing those strategies and working with industry at the right time and the right way, do you think it works well today? Government? So, one person who believes it works well, that's great. But I think, again, the authority today comes straight from Matt Blum. Try something new. And I would just encourage that you keep thinking about what you can do to test, to pilot, as Eric's doing, and listen closely. Eric's willing to try anything, right? And he does. And I guess I want to ask you all two-part question. A lot of people talk about agile acquisition and how do you get all the right people, whether it's the program, the mission, the procurement, the financial people. How well does that work with you all? And a question about requirements development. Ken, you talked about having a vision. Well, early on when you have a vision, do you need any of these other people if you want to just talk to industry about your vision? The market research part?
You muddied the equation. I was with you right up until market research. The answer is you don't. You can engage, and you should engage. The reason that the market research became a bit of a buzzword and made the hair on the back of my neck stand up is the way it should be done versus the way it's actually done. And if it should be done by the requirements owner, the technical side, but that is a role that has often been abdicated by that group, and it's defaulted back to the contracting community. So I get worried when we talk about market research, should versus is. So yes, engagement with industry is something that is very beneficial early on, and it doesn't have to be about the specific requirements. You're talking about the vision. You're talking about the big picture, the organizational structure that was earlier discussed. How does it fit in? What are the things that I'm worried about? Not, I need to send a missile so far to hit a circle that's this big, on such and such a time scale. Talk about, hey, how am I got logistics problems. How do I want to move a capability from one side of the planet to the other side of the planet? Or in theater? Or is it a small location? Those are the kinds of discussions that can really help influence the little r requirement that becomes the contract requirement. So they should engage, and I would encourage it. But right now, we definitely are having our challenges in getting that community to engage at the level and do the true market research as it's actually defined and envisioned in support of the process.
Well, I think that's a great answer, and I think it gets right to where Matt was talking about. The mission-focused acquisition is getting the people who really own the requirements, talking to the people about what a vision is and how to meet that vision in different ways. Scott, turn it over to you for the same kind of question, and the question is really that engagement with industry early on, and what parts of the team, the government team, when should they come together, or are you comfortable with your end users or you as the IT leader just saying, I don't need you acquisition, I want to find out the best ideas?
Yeah, we try to, again, broadly, not just from IT, we try to very early, as I mentioned, engage with industry to include academia, nonprofits, to take a look at our current portfolio, our obstacles, I mentioned our multi-year program plans. I don't think I mentioned our tech roadmaps, more like 15-year over the horizon documents. And so we try to do this regularly from an ideation point of view, where we are truly looking at creative ideas to solve problems. This is more from a technical and programmatic standpoint, not as much, say, from a acquisition or a policy standpoint. So we are trying to do that, perhaps based upon the feedback in here. We need to do a better job on that, so I can certainly take that back. We very much also want to have what we call our business operations folks involved as well, not just our technical side or technology development side. We'd like to have our financial folks, we'd like to have our procurement folks. One thing that perhaps hasn't been mentioned, but it's a big thing in our area, is our environmental folks, our NEPA, which has been a problem in the past. So if we're doing geothermal projects and we have federal funds, can't do any drilling without environmental reviews, and that really becomes a long pole in the tent for any number of our projects, and became an issue without dredging up too much, going back to President Obama's first administration, again with the first term, I'm sorry, with the Recovery Act, but all those projects were supposed to be shovel-ready, if folks remember that. And so we had $17 billion, 3,000 projects, and some of those really never got off the ground whatsoever because they were not shovel-ready. And there was a question that came all the way from Congress to Scott Hine and said, hey, Scott, they want to know why your projects aren't shovel-ready. And I was like, that's not for me to answer that one, but we worked through that a little bit. So part of that is because we did not have, there's so much going on, so much, so fast. And so we've written it into policy now within an internal policy within our office that, again, legal, procurement, finance, environmental, and any other office that might have an impact on a particular procurement and or a particular project get involved from day one. Now, are we actually eating our own dog food and doing that? Certainly, I'm confident we can do a better job of that, but we do have a principle in place that is something that is expected of all of our offices. Could we do a better job? I'm sure.
Well, thanks, and I think having dealt also with the National Environmental Policy Act, it is the critical path, the long pole in the tent, and that's, you're talking about bringing stakeholders together. And I've always defined a stakeholder as somebody could put a stake in your heart.
Yeah.
So you do have to bring them together, and you have to work with them. Doug, from your perspective, again, the question is looking at if you could bring all the members of the team together, do you need to do that at the beginning, or where do you do that in order to optimize the process? And getting to Ken's point of starting with a vision.
Yeah, I'd say we're going to pick up on Ken's point that, first of all, there's two reasons that I think we see success versus failure. One is an improper scoping, which was a comment that Mike made earlier. We just don't really understand clearly what it is we're trying to solve here. And the second one alludes to Ken's point, bringing in the subject matter experts, the SMEs, the stakeholders, doing the market research before you get involved. And that involves people who not necessarily are typically invited, legal, compliance, a lot of the laws that govern it. Understanding that stuff early on makes the difference between success and failure. It's that simple. If we don't get involved with J3 and some of the other people on the fence side, the different business owners early on, really understand what they truly want, get that context, then everything downstream is not going to do that. And a lot of the times the ASO types of teams that bring and do the requirements effort early and get that clear understanding, then are much more set up for success. They can take, you talked about agile on agile, but there's a difference between agile, the development approach, and agility. If we can slice up the procurement into something that can be done within 18 months or earlier in terms of delivery, that fits a government cycle. So that, but make sure that the thread of pearls that compromises the total change is in place in a way that makes it work. That helps us both with funding and delivery. So that kind of 18 months is kind of a magic number to be able to make sure that we have everything in place to make things happen.
And Mike, if I heard you correctly, as soon as you get a requirement from another customer coming in, you immediately form an IPT.
Yes.
And then that IPT is the one that then engages with industry, correct?
Yes.
Well, let me ask also about, Ken, you like to call market research, but different from when I was in it's not the same as trying to explore your vision. I understand that, but the market research does become an important phase. And different from when I was in government. If you work at the VA now, because of the Supreme Court Kingdomware decision, the results of your market research can be the basis for a protest. That was never the case when I was there, and I'm a believer in maximizing small business opportunities. As you're doing the engagement with the industry, trying to define the art of the possible, how do you do this in a way that helps small business? Ken?
That requires a lot of expertise inside the government in understanding the market intelligence about that, and understanding the requirement down to almost the WBS work breakdown structure discussion, so that you can actually facilitate the breaking apart or the segmentation of the actual executable tasks that lead to that vision and the statement of objectives. And right now, I think that there has been a little bit of a pendulum swing in how much we in the government are asking a single vendor to do and relying on subcontracting and teaming arrangements and those type things. It's a challenge under our category management. Oftentimes, the PM wants to have their vision covered, as in, I need contracted support for a weapons system. Pick a weapons system, I'm sure that there's a letter and a couple digits that you can immediately lead to mind. There is a certain amount of benefit in integrating the PM and the HR and the financial and all the aspects that run that program, but there's also a cost because those weapon system programs are often covered by a single large prime. So I need folks to not only understand that when you're asking for an executive assistant or a legal secretary or some sort of non-weapon system related skill set, that you can break that out, that you can get that to the small business. And additionally, they've got to have the leadership to execute those decisions. So an earlier question, I think, Ken, you asked, what can you do to be, the change agent? Ask those questions. Learn the market, learn your requirements, and ask for these kinds of things that provide that benefit. And it's a tough thing to do, but it is something that I think is so important, and we really are working within the department with the Defense Acquisition University. There's a panelist, Larry Floyd, who's going to be up here in a little bit. We're working with small business inside and outside of the department, and with category management, to really get an understanding of how these things can fit together and what it takes to be an integrator and make good financial or good life cycle cost decisions about us engaging in a lead systems integrator role, because it's not one size fits all.
Well, that's a great answer. And Scott, let me see if you can duplicate that great answer. And really the question was, how do you use that engagement with industry, developing the requirements, the objectives, and also find out how to maximize small business opportunities?
Yeah, I think it's much of a follow-on, as like Ken just mentioned. It's really making a determination on what part of the work really is part of perhaps the core work that would be done by the prime or the large, I guess, prime contract. What could be carved out either within that contract from a partnership agreement, or perhaps even though it becomes cumbersome, is how best to have multiple contracts supporting the same technical office, a weapon systems, PEO type of office. I think certainly it's industry asking those questions. Is this to be expected that one contract is to provide everything, the partnering arrangement and sub arrangement? And so I don't think it's much more from that. From what we've seen, we work with our small business office within the Department of Energy to see what it is we can do to better ensure that certainly that we're meeting our targets. But that's one thing more from a bureaucratic standpoint, but also what can we do to make sure we're providing the greatest value for the funding to each mission office that we have. And certainly at the end of the day, it might not matter as much from a program or project standpoint, as long as my mission's being achieved. I don't care if it's from a large company prime or a smaller company sub, but as long as the work can get done. There is one thing I know we have seen in the past, at least from a DOE point of view, is that some of these smaller businesses come in and perhaps they don't have the bandwidth in terms of ensuring that they can transition kind of some of the legacy folks that are under the contract being paid some amount, they come on board, and that there's some hard decisions being made in terms of who they can keep. And from we've gone through this twice, I think, in the last 18 months, and some of the tech offices haven't been pleased that they've actually lost a lot of legacy contractor staff to really know the mission and the culture of the organization, because the new contract can't really afford them. And they wound up going through national labs to get work done, and so they were somewhat, we got gigged on this by the IG, they wound up violating the intent of the contract that was put in place, because the work, the scope of work was not actually being met because the tech office was going through the labs to get the work done. And so I think that's something, again, perhaps you might talk about here, one of the final questions is how do we make sure we bring procurement and legal and the program together to ensure that, again, meet the mission in the best way you can while maximizing the funds that you have, but also while not violating the spirit and intent of the legal matters from a contract standpoint.
I think you all probably give roughly the same answer there, and I think that process is important. In the VA, it's protestable, but I think looking at, as you said, Scott, talking about the bandwidth of the industry, I've always believed it's also about the bandwidth of the government. You know, you can break everything up in small business, as I saw down in one DHS office. Then they found out they didn't have the internal capability to manage that, and I think that's very important. We only have a few minutes left. I guess I'd like to leave some time for questions. Anybody wants to challenge our panel members? I know we're the first panel, but
Hey, buddy.
let me start at the very back of the room.
Not really the challenge.
Hello. Hi, my name is Nathan. I appreciate the information you guys are sharing, panel. You're doing an excellent job. I did have a question, and it was partially answered, but I just wanted some clarification, because one of the things that I guess seems to be a challenge is that during the industry day efforts, or the efforts to, say, define the requirements document, I was just wondering what safeguards do you have in place to ensure that, like, a small business or the small business community is being considered for high-tech versus low-tech assignments, number one. And then number two, I'm thinking, how do you proactively include the small business in the process so that the requirements document is not being slanted towards the large business community when it's being defined? Because it seems like the large business has the propensity to dominate the industry in some degree, because we inherently believe that bigger is better and bigger is smarter, to the point to where we erroneously exclude a lot of extremely qualified and value-added small business vendors. So please.
Well, it's a great question. I think we just talked about that, and it's from a small business perspective, everything's cited towards large business. If you're a large business, it seems like everything's going small business, so sometimes it's where you stand depends upon where you sit. And if you're medium-sized, there's nothing. Right? Anybody else? Mike, you want to address that?
So thank you for the question. So we engage with small business, as I said a while ago, when I mentioned industry partners outside the context of requirement. We do calls with large businesses and small businesses. But specific to the requirement, when we call an industry day, we send out advance notices to both large business and small businesses. Right? And then once we identify, depending on the complexity, if we go into large business, during due diligence, we do ask for the team. We encourage that the large business brings in their small businesses partners to make sure that the small businesses understand what is happening as well as the large business. And then on the evaluation part of that, we use GSA contract vehicles, obviously, a very high percentage of that, with the GWAC and Alliant and Oasis work. And there is a requirement in those two contract vehicles of the small business and subcontracting percentage goals that businesses, large businesses, making sure that they meet those goals. So besides that, we engage with our OSBID, right, Office of Small Business. And then on top of that, we also engage with the SBA PCRs to make sure that everybody truly understands how we are encouraging small business to participate. Even though we know it's a large business requirement, we want to make sure that the small businesses are being filtered in to make sure that they get a part of that work. And then on top of that, the part of the evaluation criteria, we make sure that we address how the large businesses, as part of their program management, some level of factors there, make sure that they're addressing how they will encourage and manage small business participation into the requirements, if they get the award. And that will be part of the award determination. I shared a while ago with you that we do a lot of cost plus award fee. So once we do the award fee determination board, small business is a very high part of that, high percentage for their award. So, long story short, we do a lot to make sure that we encourage small business to participate in our requirements, even though it is going to a large business.
Thanks. Another question back here?
Yes, hi, Mike Brilsky from Department of Justice. I'm still trying to wrap my head around this idea that we can let the industry help us write the requirement. So,
I didn't say help. They can write the requirement.
well, I know, yeah, okay, even worse. So, can you point us to some FAR references, executive orders, something that we can share with our, and I'm sitting with a group from the same agency effectively, something we can point our COs to that help us engage industry to help us write the requirement, or literally write the requirement, because we haven't had success in that manner. It's all on our shoulders to write it, and at some point they completely shut us off from talking to industry. So,
Well,
I want to hear what ideas you got.
sure, let me address that. First of all, I often talk to early on acquisition professionals, and I ask them, when does the blackout period start? When do you stop talking to industry? And it's a trick question because the answer is never. You don't have to. I've met with one particular offer among several offers after the proposals are in because we thought it was in the best interest of the government to do it. Now, we did it using, as the Air Force used to call it, the none rule. Nones travel in twos, always two people in the room. But in terms of what I've done, I brought together, by doing an advisory down select somehow, getting white papers, bringing in those companies. Everybody has a fair opportunity, sitting down together with them and saying, help us write the statement of work, or saying, write the statement of work. You have to deal with the organizational conflict of interest question, and how do you do that fairly so you don't prohibit them from bidding on the larger requirement. But let me ask you a question. So if you have all the internal smarts to know what your mission is, what your objectives are, what your vision is, what your requirements should be, then what's wrong with letting somebody else do that work and then you modifying that text, changing it? If you have those internal smarts, why not let them put it down on paper?
I don't have a problem with it.
I would say Matt Blum said it's okay, right, Matt? But the question is, if you have that internal smarts, then you can check that work and truly represent what the government and the taxpayer needs. If you don't have those internal smarts, you can't do it anyway. So letting industry do that, but you checking and making sure you are the representative of the government, the mission, and the taxpayers. You take what they give you, and you can have 3 or 4 different statements of work, and then figure out what is the government's true needs and objectives. So, I'm sorry, I answered that question. I'm sorry. Right here, this gentleman.
Thank you. I'm George Sullivan from the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, CO. Previously, I worked in the DoD, and my question for Mr. Brennan is actually more focused on the DoD issue. So earlier you talked about suggesting that the DoD revise its requirements development process to more give a vision. It sounds like a SUE approach to contractors, and letting them more or less spell out, provide the details on how they're going to perform the requirements. Are you, in this context, are you suggesting perhaps a return to the sort of total system performance responsibility approach, or the lead system, putting more emphasis on the lead system integration approach?
I don't think we can make that jump yet, because most of the things, my day job is regarding services, and a lot of these are standalone support services in maintenance, in BOSS, engineering, et cetera, as opposed to the more monolithic MDAPs. So I don't want to get that far in the weapon systems discussion, but I think in services that we are in a position to begin to define these a little bit more along that line and reap some benefits without going over to the full lead systems capability that you described.
Okay, and would that also involve, would that also involve more of like a shoulder-to-shoulder contracting approach? I think it's now being called alpha contracting is in the latest buzzword. Or are you still looking at more of a kind of across-the-table sort of contracting approach?
Right now, we're still looking at a more across-the-table approach because we are trying to preserve the command authority of defining the requirements and getting that support that makes that warfighter successful. But I think that there is an opportunity in the future, and we're having a struggle in category management in certain sectors regarding that kind of shoulder-to-shoulder capability to buy as a department while still balancing the individual warfighter needs. So long-term vision, no.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Time
you.
for one more question? Well, two, real quick, back here.
And I'm fairly new to this, so it may be a bit of a naive question. I spent most of my career in private industry, just got into government contracting about 2 years ago. But one of the challenges I have is, as I'm responding to things like RFIs, for example, they're typically written with a certain sort of approach embedded. And I'm nervous about coming out against that approach because then my name's associated with, I kind of disagree with the path you're taking. So is there a way that you recommend putting some of those alternative approaches out there without sort of tying to your name the fact that the path that was being outlined may not be the best path?
I can suggest one thing is the wording in the RFI is often telling. Please respond directly to what we've said, as opposed to we're open to other ideas. And I would just suggest, if it truly is an RFI, put the wording in there from the government's perspective that says you're open to other ideas. Mike, you want to say something? Briefly, we
just,
have one more question.
yeah, just trying to understand the question. So the fear that you have, the question is the retribution part of it?
Well, it's not retribution. It would be nothing that cynical. It's more one of, I'm saying I wouldn't do it this way, I'd do it another way.
Yes.
And if the decision is to do it this way anyway, you kind of branded yourself as not in agreement.
So
It's nothing cynical.
yeah,
It's
yes.
just
Thank you for
human nature,
the
right?
clarification. So yes, to his point, there are some pointed questions over there that we're trying to get to ensure that we are able to evaluate and analyze the same answers across the response across the board. However, it does not prohibit you in providing additional language there of what you think is the best solution, because we read them, we evaluate them, we analyze them. So answer the question, and then if you feel that you need to provide more inputs, a different approach, put it in.
Jim, just real quick.
Sure, go ahead, Ken.
After 30 years, I guess I'm still naive. The acquisitions that I review, they're not paying that close attention. The RFI is an RFI. The proposal is what's being evaluated. And the fact that you wrote a well-written proposal that is at odds with the way you suggested it is immaterial. Is it a good proposal? It doesn't meet. So maybe I'm being naive, but
And that's the context I don't have. So I
Yeah.
just get nervous thinking about submitting something that's completely
yeah,
different.
I wouldn't be, because from where I see it, that's not an issue.
Okay, a gentleman standing up.
Good morning, thank you. My name is Rick. I'm from a large IT research and advisory services company. We're large, so we're not in that small socioeconomic class. We also do all of our business through firm fixed price. So I realize that changes from the way you guys do business sometimes. We've had the experience, to speak to the gentleman from DOJ, where a statement of work actually was written by one of our competitors. Everyone uses Word, and when you go on File and you drop down to Properties, there's the actual person's name, and when you look them up on LinkedIn, They're the senior proposal manager from our competitor. The difference in time was 20 minutes from the time that it was written to the time that it was issued. So someone handed this, and out it came. So I take a little issue with you want somebody to write a statement of work from industry. Now we have to find a way to compete with it.
Well, I would say in that particular instance, nobody from the government looked at it. Nobody said, this is our requirement. And the example I gave was letting multiple companies either in the same room or do it. But if you're going to do it with just one company, you know, you probably do run into the organizational conflicts of interest and you shouldn't do that. But if you're going to do it with one company and it comes in and 20 minutes later you say, that's the government's requirement, that means that I'm sorry, but the people in the government didn't do their job to determine what is truly necessary and in the best interest of the mission and the taxpayer. So that's a horrible way to do things.
Unfortunately, it was not a one-off experience.
Okay, well, that shouldn't be done that way, let me just say that. I think we have about 2 minutes left. I would like to thank the panel and give them 2 minutes of applause. Thank you. Let me lastly say, I really appreciate ACDI putting this on, and I think if the surveys were correct, not everybody's happy with this process, and I would challenge the acquisition community of interest to continue to do what Matthew said, explore new ways to test new things. Thank you.
Here's the whole idea.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will have a 15-minute break. Please be back by 10:15.
Yeah, I'll be around all day. Oh yeah, I'm gonna go through the morning.
Moved over, so that's Chicago, which means you're so you're Ross at Energy, and GSA rep out of big service in Chicago. You were going to come to the December meeting and then couldn't come last minute, something happened.